London is not just some city. Its spirit stands outside of time. Certain places have influenced its citizens. It is not only a setting, but a presence, a character in various films, novels, and poems. My name is Philip Röttgers, and I search for London's spirit. I think there are two particular ways to explore the powerful and mysterious place that is London: through literature and through walking. Follow me into a secret world. Follow me to London beyond time and place. In this series, I will explore its spirit by walking the city and talking to London enthusiasts. I invite you to join me. Together, we will discover London beyond time and place. This is Talks Beyond Time and Place. Hello everybody to Talks Beyond Time and Place. My name is Philip Röttgers and my guest today is Angela Buckley, author of the historical true crime series Victorian Supersleuth Investigates. The first book was The Real Sherlock Holmes, but today we will focus a bit or more about on her second book, which recounts the frantic race to stop one of Britain's most prolific murderers, Amelia Dyer. The book is called, I'm going to show it, Amelia Dyer and the Baby Farm Murders. And we will also talk a bit about baby farming in general, I think. We'll see. Yep. So I'm very happy to have the author here today. Thank you very much for joining me, Angela. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I already mentioned your first book, The Real Sherlock Holmes. And as I said, this is the second one, but I know there are more. So maybe you can... we can start by you telling us a bit about this series of books that you're writing, and maybe also how you came to be a writer. Maybe a bit about you.
Well, I started dabbling in crime, in Victorian crime, after I started researching my family tree. So I'm from Manchester, and most of my ancestors were very poor. They weren't all from Manchester, actually. Some came from as far away as Italy and France, but mostly they were in Manchester, where I grew up. And when I started investigating my English side of the family there, I discovered that my 3 times great-grandfather ran a notorious brothel in the centre of Manchester in the 1860s. And so that's one half of that story. And then the second half is my Italian family were in Manchester towards the end of the 19th century. So they came in the 1880s. And they were part of a big Italian community. And there was a very famous local detective there called Jerome Caminada. And when he started policing in 1868, he was actually my ancestor, the brothel keeper's brothel, was on his beat. Oh. So I kind of was really drawn into the adventures of Detective Caminada, partly because of my kind of, nefarious ancestor, and also because he was very much part of my Italian community, or my heritage there. And so I wrote about him. I wrote a biography about him. And then afterwards, I was looking for something else to do, and I looked at local history. So I currently live in Reading, and I discovered, and I'm not from Reading, obviously, so I've been here a while now, but when I first got here, I discovered that not far from where I live here in Reading, one of Britain's most notorious serial killers had actually disposed her tiny victims in the River Thames, which is just literally 20 minutes walk away from where I live. So that's what led me into the story of Amelia Dyer.
And then you decided to turn it into a series of books.
So this is actually the first in the series, that the Amelia Dyer one. The other one is published separately, and so since then I've added a second book, which is Who Killed PC Cock. And for that one, I've gone back to my roots in Manchester, and this was a young police officer who was killed by a bullet in 1876. By an unknown burglar, literally just a few yards from where my family home in Old Trafford. So it's a place that I know incredibly well. My parents still live there, and I know all the landmarks in the story. So it was kind of a bit more of a personal journey, really, to find out about PC Cock. And it's an extraordinary story because it has a huge twist. So I won't tell you the whole story, but it gets a guy, William Havron, gets convicted of PC Cock's murder and sentenced to death. And then 3 years later, there's this extraordinary twist which, you know, happens in real life more than you'd think.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna have to read that one. I haven't yet, I have to confess, but now I'm gonna have to read it. Now I want to know. I want to know the story and the
I'm
twist.
not going to tell you what, you know. I'm not.
Oh,
No
please
spoilers.
don't. Okay, so yeah, as you just said, Angela, you not far from where you live, Amelia Dyer. I'm just going to read the bit that's on the back of your book, because I think it's very kind of, it sets the atmosphere of what happened there. So on the 30th of March, not far from now actually, 30th of March 1896, a bargeman hooked a parcel from the River Thames at Caversham, and inside the brown package was the body of a baby girl. She had been strangled with tape. So this is also the opening scene of your book. I think it's very suspenseful, even if one knows the case and knows how it ends. But I was really, you know, I really wanted to know, okay, how did it develop from there? When did they stumble upon Amelia Dyer? How did they trace her? So maybe you can tell us a bit what happened from there on, and maybe also how you stumbled upon this very story once you happened to be in Reading.
So, well, I started researching this story from the perspective of Reading, because the story actually starts in Bristol 30 years before. But for me, what was most interesting was how the events unfolded here in Reading, and the reaction of the local residents to it. So that's where I start. So you're absolutely right. On the 30th of March, 1896, this bargeman who's coming up the Thames. The Thames was a really busy waterway at the time, with lots of businesses and lots of coming and going of traffic, boat traffic. And he sees a barge, and him and his mate they move the barge over to where the package is, and they drag the package through the water with a hook. And then when they open the package in the barge, they discover to their horror a tiny foot, and they realize that this is actually, unfortunately, a baby. So they take the package to the local police station, which is literally 15 minutes walk. It's all of the places in this story still exist in Reading. So
I wanted to ask you that. Yeah,
it's really atmospheric. So they took the package, went to the mortuary, and when they opened it, they discovered the body of a baby girl aged between 6 and 12 months old. She didn't have any clothes on. She'd been wrapped in newspaper and linen, and then in brown paper parcel tied with string. And she'd been strangled because she had some white tape around her neck. So this was a horrific discovery. I mean, to be fair, there were lots of children, bodies of children or babies discovered in the Thames, you know, along through that period. But this was particularly horrific, and it was clear that she'd met a violent death. Now, in fact, funnily enough, as a slight aside, the package was actually discovered in the loft of one of the investigating officer's descendants in 2017. So you can find it online if you look. You know, that's quite extraordinary. So, and the package is key to the beginning of the investigation, because when they dried it out, they discovered that it had a faint address on the package, and it said Mrs. Thomas, 26 Pigots Road, which is in Caversham, quite close to the river. So the police went round to Pigots Road to try and find out who Mrs. Thomas was, and they discovered that she'd gone and there was nobody there at that address. So one of the investigating officers, Detective Constable James Anderson, had this brilliant idea to take the package to the railway station, Reading railway station, to see if there was any information about it, because the package also had a Midland Railway stamp on and a date, which was the 25th of October 1895, and it had come through Bristol Temple Meads railway station to Reading. So it must have been logged, you know, it must have been logged somewhere. So a clerk at Reading railway station told the police that in fact the package belonged to a Mrs. Dyer, her name wasn't Thomas, and that she'd since moved to 45 Kensington Road, which was a property, as like with the others, that still exists on the other side of Reading. And that's how the investigation started.
You just said that the sites still exist, so so have you been there? Obviously, I think you have. So
I have many times, and I do take crime walks sometimes around there. So the river has hardly changed. The bridge where some of the rest of the story unfolds has been replaced, but the walkway is still there. It's incredibly atmospheric. All the paths are the same as they were in 1896, and there's 2 properties on the side of the river by Caversham Lock that still have people in. They still, still addresses. I've been contacted by residents sometimes as well. I don't tend to go in. If I take a tour group, I just very casually mention it. I don't like to stand outside and gawp. And also the other property, Kensington Road, is still there. So, and the police station building, that's not a police station anymore. I think it's a solicitor's company, but it's really fascinating to walk around and see all these places where this drama takes place.
I can imagine. If I ever get to Reading, which I will, then I'm going to have to take a tour with you, and you're going to have to show me all the sites, because now I'm hooked.
The last time I did it, I was telling the story about the package by the towpath, and to a group of people in quite a loud voice, and just on the river just next to me there were some people in a boat drinking champagne. I'm telling this terrible, gruesome story. It was quite amusing.
Would have been I'm still waiting for the day where you would do a tour like that, and suddenly, all of a sudden, just a package would flow down the river, just an empty package, but it would be like, oh my God, what is that? So,
I have done it with ghost hunters, actually, to get some data for them. We didn't actually do the ghost hunting, but we did it, and that was quite strange, actually. I'm not sure I'd be going back with them at the dead of night to try and find Amelia Dyer's ghost, but yeah, it was interesting.
Maybe not. I did find a ghost story about her, but that's London based. I'm gonna mention that later, because it's at the end of her life. Maybe you've heard about it, maybe you haven't. We'll see. So. I imagine one thing before we go on with the story a bit.
Sure.
When you write such a book, I think you must sometimes feel, well, yeah, horrified when you describe the way of killing, the way these babies or these infants were killed. So is it difficult to separate that, to just see it professional, or does it touch you personally also very much?
Yeah, I don't enjoy actually talking about Amelia Dyer, even though I give numerous talks and do all sorts of work around it. It's not something I love. I mean, I love the investigation, and I really enjoy working out how the police detectives solved the case. That's my kind of real interest. I enjoy the social history, because I think I've done some more work since on baby farming. I find it quite interesting about who were these women who did this, what were their the victims in terms of the mothers who gave their children, and what were they like, what was their background. So I enjoy that. I don't really enjoy the horror of it particularly. Some people quite enjoy that aspect of true crime. It's not really for me. And I have children. I mean, they've survived. They're grown-ups now, but I used to take my children when they were very small down to the river, where Dyer put her victims. So I do find the story incredibly sad, and often if I see things in the news today about children being obviously it affects us all, but I can't, if you read in today in the news about babies being abandoned or children being abused, it does affect me, and I have to kind of separate that from these historic stories. But I also think it's important to tell the truth about the past, and also particularly with the victims. I've done more work on the victims of this since, and actually to tell their stories is also as important, rather than just talk about the perpetrators.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what you just said. That's the thing with true crime. It's more about the social history, or at least what interests me. But I know there are quite a lot of people, or some people, who are interested really in the act of killing and what happened, which I think is very, very odd, very, very gruesome. That's not what it's about. It's about the history, the social history, and of course also the victims. So yeah, of course this is also about the victims and not just about Amelia Dyer, what we're talking about now.
Yeah, and I've seen. Yeah. I mean, I have the photographs of those the two key babies in this case. They're on public display at the Thames Valley Police Museum. But I often look at those photographs. They're not gruesome. They're just literally, they just look peaceful.
Right.
But I often find that quite upsetting. In fact, I was at the National Archives just last week looking at some other baby farming stories. And as I went, it was just some random pile of stuff from Metropolitan Police files. And as I got to the bottom of one of the piles, it's a different story, this one, but and I haven't researched it very well yet. But there was a piece of card turned downwards. If you sort of turn side down, so I could just see the back of it. It didn't have anything written on the back, and it was the last piece in the stack. And when I turned it over, it was a beautiful picture of a rather ghostly picture of a small girl, just like a portrait picture. She was alive at the time, and I knew that she was the victim. And it's moments like that where she's just lost in that pile of documents with no name on. I know who she is, but there was no name on it. It was obviously just a studio portrait that maybe the parents had given to the police, and there she was, you know, just hiding there, and you know, for a century. So those are the kind of things that, you know, so I haven't done it yet, but you know, I want to know more about her. You know, who was this child? You know, who were her parents? So that's what inspires me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it will be interesting when you return to that research to find out more about her and all these people and all the victims, unfortunately. Yeah. So as you mentioned, a faint name and address on the sudden wrapping provided Reading police with their first clue. So when did they stumble upon Amelia Dyer? How did she enter the story?
So they went round to Amelia Dyer's known address at 45 Kensington Road quite soon after. It was actually on the 1st of April. But when they got there, they discovered that she was absent, which wasn't particularly helpful. She'd been away for the weekend. It was actually Good Friday, it was the Easter weekend. So they arranged a sting operation. They arranged to go back on the 3rd of April when they hoped that she'd be home. But instead of the police going themselves, they sent a decoy. Now, there were no female police officers in 1896 at all. So they arranged, presumably, for one of the police officers' wives to go around in the morning and to make an arrangement to meet Amelia Dyer that evening on the pretext of her wanting to have her baby adopted. So they already knew that Amelia Dyer was a baby farmer, or they had suspicions that she was a baby farmer. So that was why they kind of did it in this particular way. And then when on the 3rd of April, in the evening, when Amelia Dyer opened the door, there was a knock on the door. When she opened the door, she actually found 2 police officers on her doorstep instead of the woman that she had expected to meet. So they entered her property at 45 Kensington Road. They questioned her, but she didn't say a great deal. But they had a search around the house, and they found evidence of baby farming. So they found lots of infants' clothing drying out on the rack by the fire. They found pawn tickets, so for babies' clothing, where Amelia had taken babies' clothing to pawnbrokers, you know, for money. They found letters from parents and vaccination certificates. Now, there were a couple of babies in the property and some children as well, and you know, there were quite a few people in the property. But also the officers went upstairs and they discovered a rather horrible smell, and they kind of literally followed the smell to a closet in the bedroom where they found a locked tin box. And when they had Amelia open the box, and there's no police reports of this, so I'm only going on the newspapers, but the newspapers at the time said that the box bore the traces of a corpse. So, you know, you have to leave it to your imagination what might have been in that box. So they knew that she was a baby farmer. They also found some white tape in her work basket, you know, for sewing. So, and the child had, you know, this white tape around her neck. But of course, they'd still needed evidence. You know, they needed a positive identification of that child, and she'd actually been in the water for almost, well, certainly 2 weeks at least. So, you know, the body wasn't in a great state, not to put too fine a point on it. So they started collecting evidence then, and their first kind of clue in the chain of evidence was to look at the letters from the parents that they found in the property at 45 Kensington Road to try and work out how many children there were, who this child was, and who other children might be, and then to try to get to a situation where some parents could come and identify a body, because obviously without forensics, you know, they would have had no way of identifying a child just washed up in the water, and that's what they needed to start to build a case against her.
Yeah, and I think I mean, when they discovered who they had there and how long this has been going on, you know, they uncovered quite a huge case. But I think after this first body was found in the Thames, more bodies were found. I think two more bodies in a carpet bag, and then this whole this whole case was uncovered. So how did it go on from there, and how many victims were there overall? Can we even say that? Do we know that?
Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, they found so they obviously arrested Amelia Dyer, and she was put into Reading prison whilst investigations were going on, and they held an inquest on that first baby. They kind of identified that first child as a baby called Helena Fry, because of a letter that they found at Kensington Road. But and they used that name, but there was no real way of identifying her, you know, because the body wasn't in a good enough state. So although there is a name attached to that first baby, it's not certain that that's who she was, and it certainly wasn't enough to build a case against Dyer. So they started dragging the Thames, so round Caversham Lock, where the first baby was found. They got labourers to start dragging operations, and there were 2 more babies found quite soon afterwards, but they never identified those. And then on the 10th of April, so roughly a week or so later, they made this particularly horrific discovery in the Thames. So as I said before, there's a bridge that goes across the Thames at that point called the Clappers Bridge. It still exists, it's just now a big iron bridge rather than it used to be a wooden bridge. And halfway across that halfway across that bridge under the water, they found a carpet bag. And when they took the carpet bag out of the water, they found, and again, it was wrapped, there was newspaper inside. When they removed the newspaper, they found the body of a roughly 4-month-old girl. And then underneath her, they found the body of a 13-month-old boy. Now, this actually was a game changer, because the police had been chasing up the parents in the letters at 45 Kensington Road. They were actually able to bring the parent of one of these children and the guardian of the other to Reading the following day on the 11th of April to make a positive identification. And these children hadn't been in the water very long. They'd probably been in there about 10 days. So it was easy to identify them. And they also were dressed. So the guardians could also identify their clothing. And one of the children, the little girl, was identified as 4-month-old Doris Marmon, and her mother came to identify her. And then the boy was Harry Simmons. He was 13 months old, and his guardian came to identify. He was from London, or he'd come from London. His guardian came to identify him, and particularly Doris. The investigation around her, that particular situation sealed the fate of Amelia Dyer, and the police were able to build a case on that positive identification. There were others found in the river. Around that time, there were 7 or 8 children found in the river, but Doris was the one who was only securely identified.
Okay.
And Amelia Dyer had been doing this for 30 years in Bristol. So, you know, the roughly were about probably, I've tried to work out how many victims there were in Reading, and I reckon there's somewhere between 25 and 30 children came and went at the properties in Reading, and she was only there 6 months. And so if she'd been doing it 30 years prior to that, we must be talking about hundreds of babies, but obviously there's no way. I've been trying to trace some of the victims, but there's, you know, it's a bit of a difficult task.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's horrifying to think about the amount of babies, the huge number. So how do you know how many were they able to identify some of them apart from the girl?
Not really. So they could identify the girl and the boy, and there was another baby that was found in the water later on the 23rd of April, and they thought that she was a baby whose surname was Isaacs, and she'd come to Reading. She'd been brought to Reading in the September, and they reckoned she was 4 or 5 months old. And when they had the inquest, interestingly, a woman read about it in the press, and she stepped forward and said that the child was hers, and that the child was called Frances Jessie Goulding. But it's quite difficult to know, because the age of that child differs from what the age of the child that they found according to the coroner. So it's quite complicated, and there's a whole thing about the baby's teeth. You know, but did the teeth belong to the baby, and what she was wearing? So it seems likely that was Frances Jessie Goulding, even though there are discrepancies. But no, the rest, and that's it. So none of the others were identified. I mean, Amelia Dyer had stood trial in Bristol in 1879 after the inquest into 4 children who were identified at the inquest, when they basically died of malnutrition or associated illnesses like diarrhea and infections, and that were in her care at the time. But she wasn't convicted from that. She was convicted for identifying a death certificate, for falsifying a death certificate. But the problem is that well, the main problem with identification, as well as the lack of forensics, was that Amelia Dyer would change the names of babies, and she would sometimes claim them to be her own, and she would falsify birth and death certificates. So there's a small child that's buried quite close to here, where I am now, in Emma Green, a bit further away from the river, and it's a tiny graveyard that's just at the back of the school. And I went there recently to have a look. There's no marker, and there's I found the death certificate for one of the victims there for that cemetery. And on the death certificate, the child is called Ina Clara Palmer, and Palmer is actually Dyer's daughter, married daughter's name. And so they claimed her as their own. She wasted away, like many of these children did, probably due to malnutrition, being starved, and they buried her under their name. She clearly wasn't their child, but there's no idea who that child actually was. And she's in an unmarked grave, in this tiny graveyard, just hidden away. So that's the problem. It's very hard. The paper trail is very difficult to follow.
Absolutely, yeah. So when we hear that, we think she must have been, I mean, Amelia Dyer must have been very, very reckless, very brutal. No, she obviously she didn't seem to have a problem with what she was doing. So maybe we can expand a bit and maybe you can tell us a bit about baby farming in general. So what was this business like, and yeah, maybe just a bit about baby farming in general.
Sure. So baby farming was really a form of Victorian childcare, and it dates, I've seen evidence of it from the 1840s in the industrialized cities, London, Manchester. And it wasn't just for single parents. If you were a working parent, you could put your child in with a baby farmer on a weekly basis. So in Manchester particularly, there are stories or accounts of women placing their baby with a baby farmer during the day, going to the factory to work, collecting their baby in the evening. So it is like childcare. Now, by the 1860s, there starts to become an awareness of the rather nefarious side of baby farming, and the term baby farm is coined in the 1860s and 70s. And it starts in London with various social commentators worrying, and reformers worrying about the number of illegitimate children who are placed with baby farmers for adoption and for fostering for a fee. So basically what would happen is that a baby farmer would advertise in the local press for a baby to foster or adopt. If you were fostering or on a weekly basis, it would cost about 5 shillings a week. If you were having a child adopted, it could be as much as £10 for the full adoption. And basically the baby farmers would advertise for children wanted for a loving couple in a beautiful home, in a church, God-fearing, family, bring up their child in church, educate the child, and provide them with the things that the parents couldn't provide. And the victims were often the illegitimate children of unmarried women, because there was such a stigma still attached to having an illegitimate child. These women were just desperate, because often their families would shun them. Many of them were domestic servants, not all, but if they found themselves pregnant, whilst they were working, they would lose their job, they would lose their home, and they would have no income, and there was nobody to look after them. They could go into the workhouse, but that was to be, that was a last option for anybody. So often the victims were domestic servants, or certainly unmarried women, who would see these adverts and they would apply to the baby farmer to have their child adopted. And after that, usually there was a correspondence by letter, and then they would arrange to meet. And then if they wanted to go ahead with the adoption, the parent would give the child over, usually with boxes of clothing, for the child to have, and they would pay this fee. The fee is just under an annual wage for a domestic servant, so it was a huge fee. So it was a very lucrative business. And they wouldn't have heard from them again. Now, it's also important to say that in England and Wales, certainly, this was completely legal at the time, because there was no legislation preventing you from transferring the guardianship of your child from one person to another. So effectively, you could sell your children in this way, because there was nothing to stop you. Of course, it's the baby farming that leads to child protection regulation, but at the time, it was possible to do. Now, there were baby farmers who were decent people. They weren't always women, but many of them were women. But there were also some who were not. And they basically would just allow these poor children to starve to death. They wouldn't feed them properly. They would give them drugs, feed them opiates to keep them quiet. Now, this wasn't common with parents, because everybody took laudanum and opiates in the Victorian period, and parents did used to give their children opiate-based tonics to keep them quiet. So it wasn't uncommon. But the baby farmers took that one step further, and they would basically drug these children to stop them from crying, and those children would gradually waste away. And that was called, by the medical term, called marasmus. And in fact, many of us in our family history, we find children in our own family tree who died of marasmus. And it's basically just a failure to thrive, usually due to poor diet. If the mother's got a poor diet and she's breastfeeding, which of course most of them did, a child would just not, infections and illness and diarrhea. And that's what these babies died of. Now, Amelia Dyer is one of the few baby farmers who took it one step further and strangled some of the later children in her care. So it was a really sad story, really, about baby farming. But that's basically what it is.
Absolutely, yeah. But I think she wasn't the only one who took things further, right? I mean, there were other cases where baby farmers would kill the children and just to take the money. So I think there were other cases, weren't there?
There were 7 cases between 1870 and 1907 in Great Britain, and where baby farmers were convicted of murder. There might have been many more, but they were, they're the key cases. Yeah.
What I found interesting is, I mean, obviously this wasn't on just a British thing, because we have quite a famous a similar case in Hamburg here in Germany from 1905, and the woman was called Elizabeth Wiese, and she was they called her the Hamburg Engelmacherin, the angel maker of Hamburg.
Ah, interesting, yeah.
And she was convicted and executed for the killing of 5 children. And okay. She did the same thing, baby farming, basically. And there are quite a few parallels, I think, to the Amelia Dyer case. And she also drowned some of the children in the Elbe, in the river. And I think she even put some of them into the oven, but I'm not quite sure. So
that's really interesting.
Sorry?
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, I've read cases in other places. Certainly there were others in other European countries and in Australia, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, but I remember I did a tour. I was on when I was in Hamburg the last time. I did a tour with a tour guide walking around, and he told us about this story. And then when I read this book, I mean, I knew about Amelia Dyer, but then I thought, hang on, there was a similar case in Germany, and then I looked that up. So what I often wonder, I mean, as you said, there were quite a few people living with Amelia Dyer in the household, or at least in the house. She had she also rented rooms, I believe, and then there was Granny, right? I forgot her name. Sorry,
Jane Smith.
Yeah, right.
And
Jane Smith, and 2 children, two older children. Willie, I think, who was 9, and sorry, I forgot the other one, the girl.
Nellie Oliver. So Nellie Oliver was 11 and Willie Thornton was 9. That's right. And they came to looked after in Reading.
They were both reunited with their parents, and after she was arrested.
Yeah, we don't. I tried to find them, and it's very hard to. The newspapers said they were. I haven't been able to find any evidence of them being reunited, but that's what the newspaper said. I mean, Amelia Dyer was a very complex character, and very interesting because she developed a very strong bond with Willie Thornton. I mean, on the one hand, these children may have been decoys because baby farmers use decoy children, so that if the authorities came, it looked like they were, keeping children healthy, and they would use older children for that. But she was very close to Willie, and he was very close to her. He called her mother. When she was in prison in Reading jail, she was often asked about Willie and how he was getting on. But it was his carpet bag that he brought. It's quite sinister. His carpet bag that he brought his belongings in was the carpet bag which was found in the River Thames. But yeah, it's interesting that she could develop a strong relationship with some children and then and dispose quite happily, not happily, but easily perhaps. There's no evidence to the contrary of others. Very interesting.
I often wonder, but I think it was, they dealt with that during the case and during when they were at court. But didn't like, did Granny never notice that something weird was going on? Or maybe the other children, didn't they think? I mean, obviously they realized that many of the babies that came into the house were quickly they were gone. But didn't they ever suspect Amelia Dyer of killing these children? Or
not Jane Smith, no. So she was an elderly woman that Amelia Dyer had met in the workhouse in Barton Regis when things had started to go wrong in Bristol at the end of her time there. Dyer had ended up in the workhouse, and that's where she met Jane Smith. And Jane Smith was 74 years old, and she'd been in service as a domestic servant for 30 years. And then for some reason, a position, maybe she got too old, or she'd been discarded from that and ended up in the workhouse. So she was quite vulnerable. And Dyer met her, and she invited her to come and live with her, and that she'd pay her a small wage. I don't think she paid her very much, and that she came to look after the house and to care for the babies. And it's quite sad, the interviews that Jane Smith gave to the press after the crimes were uncovered are really quite sad, because she didn't seem to know. She knew that babies came and went, but Dyer had told her that she was taking them to foster parents, or that she was taking them back to their parents, and she was really devastated about the babies that she discovered that they died. So no, I don't think she did know. There's a legend in Reading that she haunts the place around 45 Kensington Road, and that apparently she can be seen walking. There's a different workhouse, the site of a different workhouse there, not the one that she was in, but she can be seen walking from the workhouse site to Kensington Road, crying for the lost babies. I don't know when that's true, but it does sum up the kind of the tragedy of Jane Smith, really. And I don't know what happened to her afterwards, because with a name like Jane Smith, she's virtually impossible to track down.
Yeah, I think she did have to go to the workhouse again, right?
I think she did, yeah.
She probably didn't live that much longer after that, if she was that old during that time. But who knows?
Yeah, I haven't checked the Reading workhouse records actually to see if she's there, but yeah, that was the point. I don't know if they exist, but that would be a good idea.
Yeah, I often wonder, what I mean. It does get a bit. We do get a bit of an insight into Amelia Dyer's character, but as you said, she had done this for such a long time. So what kind of character she might have been? Maybe even when she started, there must have been quite a why would you want to start doing that? Just for the money? Is that all, or why would you start killing children? Just I think I can't relate to that. I can't understand that.
No, none of us can relate to it. But I think she was a businesswoman. She was very ambitious. She trained to be a nurse, and she was a married woman. She had 2 husbands, and she started the baby farming business when she was married for the first time in around about 1868, when she started up. But after she met a woman, a midwife, while she was training at Bristol Royal Infirmary, she met a midwife called Ellen Dane, and she told her about this lucrative business of baby farming. So, Dyer was quite independent. The men in her life don't really feature, so she clearly wanted more from them. Her first husband was a craftsman, so he presumably had a reasonable amount of money, but her second husband was a labourer, so there wouldn't have been a great deal of money in that household. So she was ambitious, she was educated, she came from a respectable working class family herself. Her father was a master shoemaker. So she'd had, a reasonably good background, some problems in her background, or some tragedies. Two of her sisters died, and her mother died of meningitis when Dyer was 11. So she would have had some trauma there. But apart from that, all her siblings were working, they all had trades. She herself started off apprenticed as a dressmaker to an aunt, and then she moved into nursing. So she either wanted her independence, because it was very difficult for women to build up their own businesses. I mean, this wasn't obviously be a business of choice, but that was one of the things that gave her freedom, this business, financially and in terms of her personal life. She separated from her second husband, or he just disappears. And sometimes I kind of to try and rationalize it was for money, I think. And also think about that, at the beginning she was just allowing them to starve to death, but she was neglecting them essentially. She wasn't actively, as far as I believe, she wasn't actively violently murdering them. So there was, and that was, there was an element that was quite normal in society at the time. I mean, it's hard to look back at the 21st century perspective. I feel sometimes it's a bit like the unscrupulous puppy farmers that we get today. The way that people treat animals is very much the way that people people treated children, you know, in the Victorian period. They were expendable. You know, nobody cared who they were. They didn't really have identities. They didn't mean anything. And she really taps into that with this business.
Yeah, absolutely. Her daughter and her son-in-law, they were also kind of involved in the case. And I mean, if this series is called Talks Beyond Time and Place, but it's more about, it's always about London beyond time and place. So they lived in Wilston in North London. So maybe you can tell us a bit about what happened there and how they have been involved in the case.
So yes, the daughter is a really mysterious character, and there's not enough information about her, but she's believed to be Dyer's biological daughter, and her name was Mary Ann, and she married Arthur Ernest Palmer. Now, she had grown up in Bristol with the baby farming going on, and she came to Reading. They both came to Reading with Amelia Dyer in 1895, but by Christmas the family had sort of started to separate out, and Mary Ann, or she's known as Polly and Arthur went to live in Willesden, and Dyer and Jane Smith, they moved to Kensington Road. So piecing back the story, which they don't find out till later, so this comes quite a bit later, once the trial starts to, you know, the investigation for the trial starts to happen, what they discover is that on the 31st of March, Dyer had travelled to Cheltenham to collect baby Doris Marmon from her mother. Then she'd taken the train all the way to Paddington, where she'd gone to stay in Willesden with Polly and her husband. And so quite late at night, Polly opens the door, you know, the front door, and finds Amelia Dyer, her mother, on the doorstep with a carpet bag and a parcel and a baby. And that baby is Doris Marmon, the 4-month-old child that's found later in the carpet bag. So as Polly testifies, she allows her mum in, and her mother comes to stay for the evening. And the next morning, Polly sees the carpet bag on the sofa, and the parcel stuffed under the sofa, and no evidence of the baby. But she doesn't seem to question this. Now, the following day, on the 1st of April, Polly and Arthur and Amelia Dyer travel back to Paddington Station to meet another woman, Amelia Hannah Sargent, under the clock on platform 1. So next time you're at Paddington Station and the clock is still there, you know, at 12 o'clock. I always think of that poor child every time I pull into Paddington. So they met, and she was a woman from Ealing. She was an undertaker's wife, and she was taking care of Harry Simmons, who was 13 months old, for his own mother, who'd gone abroad as a lady's maid. Amelia Sargent, gets quite complicated, had 6 children of her own, and so she could no longer afford to keep Harry, so she answered this advert. So she handed Harry over to Dyer at Paddington Station on the 1st of April. Now they go back to the Willesden, to the house in Willesden, and that evening they go out to Olympia for a stroll, the adults do, and Dyer leaves Harry under a cloth or under a shawl on the sofa, and when they come back, Polly notices that the child hasn't moved, and he's 13 months old, so you know he's going to be wriggling around or walking even, but he hasn't moved. But she doesn't question that. So the next day, Dyer disappears back to Reading, and everything goes with her. So what we assume is that, not sure about Doris, but certainly Harry Simmons was killed at the property in Willesden, and possibly Doris, and that's the last sort of sighting of Dyer before she's arrested, and then she takes the babies back to Reading and puts them in the River Thames. So and they don't stay in Willesden very long. There's a bit more at best. There's lots of investigations into them, and they're often charged with, so Arthur Palmer is charged with abandoning a baby in Devonport. They move around a lot. So they're in Warminster or Devonport, they go to London, they're always moving about. They're charged, both charged as accessories in this case, but both of them, Arthur is discharged if there's not enough evidence, and Polly does go to a court here in Reading, but she's later acquitted because there's not enough evidence. They're very shadowy characters, and you never know how much they're involved. They have their own baby farming business, and in fact 2 years after Dyer's death, they're convicted of abandoning a child who doesn't actually die, but somebody finds a child in a railway carriage and they discover it to be them. And after that, they serve their time. I don't know how, can't remember how much it was, you know, couple of years in prison, and after that they completely disappear without trace. Nobody's been able to find them. So maybe they changed their names or went abroad or something. So they're very interesting characters, but very enigmatic.
Yeah. Well, wasn't it that when he was discharged of being an accomplice of Amelia Dyer, that he was quite happy and stepped out of the box of the courtroom and was arrested immediately again?
Yes,
because he had abandoned the child on the
That's
street.
right. Yes, he was quite a showy man. You know, the neighbours in Caversham thought that he was quite wealthy, and he used to walk around with a Panama hat, and you know, he liked it. They had expensive tastes, him and Polly. You know, and he used to be telling everybody about all the businesses that he was setting up. But actually, in real life, he was a bit of a failure. He didn't manage to stick at anything really. So he was very confident.
You, in the beginning, you already mentioned some of the policemen in Reading, some of the investigators. And I think the leading investigator was Chief Constable George Choosley, if I pronounced that correctly. So maybe you can tell us a bit about the police in Reading in general. I don't think there weren't that many policemen there, and how they then investigated the case after Amelia was put into Reading prison.
Well, George Choosley was actually the chief superintendent, so he was in charge of the police in Reading, which wasn't a massive force at the time, and they didn't deal with murder. And there are no records of murders, you know, in the time before that. And in fact, the charge book for the the main police station in the weeks leading up to this case only has 2 crimes that are described in full, and one is the theft of a watch from a gentleman at the railway station, and the other was the theft of a fat sheep from a field. So that's the kind of things that they're dealing with. George Choosley had been in charge of the Reading Police for almost 10 years by this stage, and he originally came from Norfolk. He was a police officer's child, so his father was a chief constable as well. So that was kind of, he was, you know, from a policing family. He was experienced, but you know, not in this. And he takes charge of the investigation, and he appoints Detective Constable James Anderson to investigate, who is assisted by Police Sergeant Harry James. So he's a uniformed officer. There aren't many, there's some detectives, there aren't detectives in Reading till the mid-1880s, so it's quite a small force and not necessarily that experienced. But what was difficult as well for these 3 men, and George Choosley takes quite a big part in this, because he's the one that does all the investigative work and that leads the inquiries, and he links up with the parents, and he also links with other police officers in other constabularies like in Bristol. But what must have been particularly difficult for these men was that they all had children and all quite young. So James Anderson, for example, he had 5 boys and his youngest was only 2. So you can imagine, you know, how difficult it would have been for all these officers dealing with this. But they don't call in the Met, which is interesting, the Metropolitan Police. There is some evidence of 2 Metropolitan Police detectives interviewing Jane Smith, but that's very unclear. So it may have even been there were journalists pretending to be police officers. So it's interesting. I think it's because they didn't realise the scale of what they were dealing with, that they didn't call in the Metropolitan Police or Scotland Yard. They didn't call in Scotland Yard, which is interesting. But because I guess they solved it themselves, which is, you know, was quite brilliant, really.
Really, it really was, yeah. And I think this is something that we can all read that in your book, and I want all of our listeners to read that to find out all the details. But what I also found interesting, just on a side note, is that when Amelia Dyer was at Reading Prison at the same time, she was there at the same time when Oscar Wilde,
yes,
when he was serving his time there.
I know.
Quite
and the trial of her daughter Polly was on the same day as Wooldridge, you know, the trooper that Oscar Wilde wrote the ballad about. You know, that was on the same day. So it's kind of weird, isn't it, when those things suddenly coincide?
Absolutely, yeah. So well, yeah, as we know, in the end, Amelia Dyer was sentenced to death. What was she accused of? You know, what did they sentence? So
she was charged with the murders of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons. Yeah, the 2 babies in the carpet bag, and it's very much the Doris Marmon case, really, which leads to the guilty conviction. And it's quite interesting. And you know, another big question about Amelia Dyer is, you know, was she mad or bad? You know, and the trial is very much an exploration of her mental state. And so she tried to commit suicide twice in Bristol. So once she'd thrown herself into a deep pond, and the other time she tried to slit her throat, but it was a very light cut, so it wasn't a very serious attempt. And this seemed to be when she was trying to escape the law. So she often had a so-called nervous breakdown, a mental sort of crisis, and then she'd be taken off to an asylum, and then she'd be cured and sent back out again. So it seemed to be a way that she was evading the law. She was also possibly a laudanum addict. Some evidence to suggest that. So much of the trial, apart from the witnesses, was various doctors and medical experts who were trying to work out whether she was insane or not, because she pleaded insanity. And she used to, you know, she talked about hearing hallucinations and voices, and she talked about images of her mother's grave, but they all disagreed. So they completely contradicted each other, and nobody really could decide, you know, exact state of her mental health.
Yeah, I think what you just, when she had the two suicide attempts in Bristol, wasn't that when there were these parents coming after her, trying to find out what happened to their child? So it was always a way of, you know, avoiding him. And
yeah, that's what seemed to be the case. It was a governess who had given her child. We don't know the name of the governess, sadly, but she'd given her child to Amelia Dyer because she'd got pregnant by the son of the household where she worked as a domestic servant. And when the parents of the house, or the man's parents, had discovered it, they'd sent him away because they didn't want him to be connected with a servant. And then a while later, they got back together and they decided to get married. So it was a kind of sad love story, really. Absolutely. And so they'd gone back to Dyer to find their child in Bristol, and she kept sort of trying to put them off the scent, and they brought the police back. And every time that they came back, as you quite rightly say, she would have some sort of crisis and be sent off to the asylum.
So yeah, in the end, it didn't help her. She was executed in Newgate prison on 10th June, right? 10th of June, right, yeah. 1896. Yeah. And as I mentioned before, there's this ghost story about her that is where her ghost is seen around the area of what is now the Old Bailey, where previously Newgate prison stood. So I think Newgate was
around Reading as well, around the paths near the river. There's the stories of ghosts.
Yeah, she must be everywhere. But I think Newgate was demolished in 1902, and there's the story. So when she was led through Dead Man's Walk, they had this walk to the gallows. She passed a young warder named Mr. Scott, and then it's just a story. It's said that she gazed at him and smiled at him in a kind of eerie way and said, "We will meet again one day, sir." And then she was executed, and a couple of years later, he was sitting in the warder's room, and all of a sudden he had this strange feeling that he was being watched, and he remembered these words, "I'll meet you again someday, sir." And then he turned around and saw her face at the window, grinning at him in horror.
Oh, really? I didn't know that story.
And then he went out into Dead Man's Walk, because the window was leading to Dead Man's Walk. And of course, he didn't find anybody there, but allegedly the handkerchief that she had when she died, it was lying on the floor just before him. So kind of an interesting story, but I think she really wasn't that. On the day of her execution, she wouldn't have done that, right? She was very she wasn't in the mood for something like that.
No, but it's a kind of the urban myths, isn't it? And in fact, you know, there is a whole myth, you know, whole mythology around Dyer. And even at the time, you know, people in the newspapers, I've read it in contemporary Manchester newspapers, you know, people thought that if a baby had been found, you know, killed or dead, which of course lots were, as I said earlier, they did attribute it to Amelia Dyer, you know, at the time, you know, had she travelled up north, you know, had she travelled here, there and everywhere. So there is, and of course there's links, you know, alleged links with Jack the Ripper, you know, so she keeps coming back in sort of in popular culture. And here in Reading, actually, I've talked to lots of people who live here who said that when they were children, you know, if they misbehaved, their parents or their grandparents would say, you know, if you don't behave yourself, old Mother Dyer will come and get you, you know. So it's interesting, isn't it, how these characters do pass into sort of myth.
Absolutely, yeah, really interesting. But in the end, it's a really sad story because of all the victims, the unnamed victims, of many of which we don't know.
The people in Caversham, actually, after this horrible thing had taken place, on the bridge, the Clappers Bridge, which had a wooden handrail, they carved crosses, you know, to remember the children. But of course, it's all gone now. It's been changed, and you know, sadly, there is no memorial to the babies that actually have perished at our hands in Reading now. I mean, you know, it would be quite nice to have one, really. And I've been trying to, as I say, trace them, because you know, otherwise they are just forgotten, aren't they? Which is even more tragic, I think.
It really is, yeah. So Angela, what is your next project? We've talked enough about Amelia Dyer. Let's talk about you again for a bit before we finish.
So I'm currently doing a PhD in Oxford, Oxford Brookes University, where I'm studying the investigative practice of police detectives in Victorian cities. So I'm looking at how the Victorian detectives developed their sleuthing skills in Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham. So I'm just coming towards the end. I'm in the last phase of that. So I haven't been doing a great deal of other things alongside. And then, yeah, but I would like to revisit the baby farming cases again at some point. I have been doing some more work, just, you know, casually on the victims. And it's something I, you know, would like to explore more once I've finished my PhD.
Yeah. That sounds very interesting. Any other book projects or nothing there right now?
Well, I have one small contribution to a book on hold, but the details of that hasn't been released yet. But yeah, I've got loads of ideas. So I'm trying to balance that with trying to get my PhD finished. But and of course that has given me a whole load of more ideas. So I have various projects, but I haven't taken anything forward. So I hope to submit my thesis, you know, towards the end of this year or early next year. And after that, I'll go back to proper writing. I mean, I just keep my blog going most of the time, and then do sort of events. But I haven't had time to not commit fully to a writing project. But I've probably got at least 12 different ideas for new books. So watch this space.
Yeah, so much more to come. We can expect much more from
absolutely.
You. Okay, so thank you very much, Angela, for being my guest for this conversation about this very sad topic, actually, but interesting nonetheless, socially, historically. I wish you all the best with your PhD and all your future projects. This is Angela's wonderful book, very suspenseful book, Amelia Dyer and the Baby Farm Murders. Of course, I'm going to put a link to the book and also to your blog, to your website, into the description of the talk. So thank you for joining me. It was great to have you here. And thank you to our viewers, as usual. Please subscribe to my channel or to my Substack newsletter, where you can get some exclusive material, or support me on Patreon for more exclusive material. You can check that out. Okay, so thank you very much, Angela.
Thank you. You're very welcome.